Hi kids, how are we doing? Today's half-arsed tutorial we're going to be looking at the circuit tracks and how I can use it to control a synth that I build on the Nord Micro Modular, composed entirely of LFOs, and you can hear it in the jam for last weekend, which is up here. I'm going to go over three things: how to set up the tracks to use as an external controller, what an LFO is, and how you can make a synth from LFOs. One of the joys of the tracks is being able to plug in other instruments, and my favourite one to plug in is the Nord Modular because it is so flexible. The tracks has 8 controllers, and you can assign those controllers, those dials, to different continuous controller data streams. So using the circuit tracks, not only can you program in notes, velocities, all of that kind of nonsense, you can also control in real time up to 8 different parameters. So you might be asking, what is a continuous controller? Well, Midi has a useful function that you can set up data streams. So the data streams were there put in to control things like aftertouch and breath, set to give a more human variation on the instruments that you're playing. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember General Midi, but that was basically the principle with General Midi. There were set continuous controllers which controlled various parameters across every General Midi synth. So your filter would always be set to one continuous controller, your resonance would be set to another one. So basically each continuous controller can be set to control a set of parameters, and these are the kind of live modulation that you can set on circuit tracks. General Midi isn't with us anymore, but circuit tracks nods in that direction when it says it generally has on the controller 1 something to do with the oscillator, and number 2 an oscillator modulation of some kind, and then 3 is an amp envelope, 4 is a filter envelope, then you've got cut off, a resonance, modulation, which is an LFO usually, and effects. So there is an attempt to be standardized, but the Nord Micro Modular doesn't do that. And if you also remember on the tracks, you've got a range from 0 to 127, and that applies to all continuous controllers. Now, setting up a new template for the continuous controllers for the Nord Micro Modular is really easy. In fact, it's easy to set up a template for anything. First of all, you have to know which continuous controllers you wish to control, and once you know what those are, you can open up components, you can select a MIDI template, and then go select new MIDI templates, and then you're given boxes where you can put in the continuous controller number, and the data range that you want to control. So it can be 128 values from 0 to 127. Right, so the next question is, what is an LFO? And then we can make the synth on the modular. To start off with, we should know what an oscillator is, and we've spoken about oscillators before in stuff about FM synthesis and other forms of synthesis using the Nord Modular. Basically, an oscillator is a value which is changed over time, and we measure the time period of that change, or the frequency of that change, in hertz, and those are the cycles of change per second. So if something oscillates every second, that's 1 hertz. Any cycle of hertz between about 20 and 20,000 tends to be in the human audible range. So that's any oscillation, any movement of air, any vibration of air within the range of about 20 to 20,000 hertz is within human hearing. And you can play with the ruler and find this out for yourself. And I used to love doing this at school. In fact, that was probably the first introduction to making strange noises and synthesis, much to the annoyance of my teachers. In synthesis terms, the oscillators which are between 20 and 20,000 hertz, we just call them oscillators because they do the job, they generate the noise that we then make synthesizer patches from. Any oscillator which is less than 20 hertz we call a low frequency oscillator. It's low, the frequency of it is lower than audible hearing. And we use those in synthesizers not so much to generate sounds, but to modulate sounds. So you will find that LFOs are used to make variations in filters, in panning, in resonance, in pitch, a whole myriad of different ways. One of the nice things about the Nord Modular is that you can drive low frequency oscillators so hard that they become just oscillators. That is, you can make them oscillate at frequencies higher than 20 hertz, and then you get them up into an audible range. Once you've got them into an audible range, you can then modulate or change the frequency of those low frequency oscillators with yet more low frequency oscillators. And this creates a very, very simple form of FM synthesis. And that's what we're going to have a look at making today. So it's a fairly standard start with a keyboard input and then an audio output and then a mixer. I like to use mixer for outputs so that if I want to have more than one sound source then I can mix up to 3 together, and I usually stack them up and double them because then I've got stereo input. Start with the standard master LFO, and whenever I kind of make LFOs in or LFO synths, because they're quite cheap in DSP terms, I quite like to stack them up. So I have multiple LFOs with different waveforms. The big difference with this particular setup than things I've done in the past is I need to have a control mixer. So one channel of the control mixer is going to have the note value input, and the other side of the control mixer is going to have another LFO running into it, and that's what will create the FM style synthesis variation and modulation in the pitch. And of course I'll plug in that second LFO in a moment once I've finished putting everything else together. And there another mixer which I can use to mix the 3 LFOs and to produce a bigger sound. And then another master LFO which will run independently, which I plug into the second input of the control mixer, and that's what's going to make the FM work. I'm going to use that, the frequency of that LFO, to modulate the frequency of the original master LFO. Of course you can't hear anything to start off with because it's a low frequency oscillator. We have to wait until we've driven the frequency up. And there I've got the notes coming in, so I can play it as a normal patch. Of course it would play continuously, so I need to put in an envelope and connect that to the gate which is coming out of the tracks. make things more interesting, I extend the release time. And now tune up the LFOs so that they've got a bigger, fatter sound, and that I'm just doing by ear. And let's give ourselves a bit of polyphony on this one. So up the top you can decide how many voices your patch is going to have. So we're going to increase the polyphony, so it's not a mono synth. And then as we open up the second control on the control mixer, that LFO, the second LFO, starts to have an effect. And you can hear the rate or the frequency affecting the original LFO, and that's the fundamentals of FM synthesis. Now I've got a very rough and ready FM synthesis engine which is based purely on LFOs. I can put a pattern in from the tracks so that I can hear what I'm doing with the next step. And this is where I set up the continuous controllers. I select the parameter which I want to control and I right click on that. Then on the drop down box I go down to Midi controllers, then I select other, and here you can see a whole list of controllers that I can assign to the parameter that I'm changing. And if you look, you can see things like breath control and main volume and expression, and these are all values that were put in for general MIDI back in the day. Now you can turn the corresponding dial on the tracks and you can change the value of that parameter so you can change things on the fly. And remember, any of the dial movements that you made on the tracks you can record as well. So this can be quite a powerful way of adding variation and interest into the sounds that you have in your sequences. Hopefully you have learned something today, and if you have and you have found it useful, make sure you press like, because that really helps my channel out. If you've made it here and you're not a subscriber, then I really think you need to subscribe for more half-arsed tutorials, because you obviously enjoyed it. And finally, if you think that there is somebody else who might find this useful, I think you need to pass it on to them. As they say at the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, share and enjoy. Bye kids!